It's time for the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith.
So every time they redraw the maps, I'm always on the outlook for, the most cartoonish, the most bizarre looking. I mean, I don't know that anything's ever going to match the one, the snake on the lake, they were calling it in Cleveland, where at one point it didn't even touch land. It was like the entire top of the state, right along the lake, about an inch deep, where they said, hey, let's figure out how we can take two Democratic districts and turn them into one, which is what they did. They ended up getting Dennis Kucinich out of office, which he's now running for mayor of Cleveland, and I wish him luck, because here's the weird thing. When I was a kid, I actually handed out leaflets when he ran for mayor back in the 70s. So the fact that he's still in Cleveland politics and maybe going to end up as mayor once again, interesting kind of turn of events. But here's the thing. Again, the map thing, really bizarre. And this is what happens when you give politicians the ability to choose who their voters are. This should never be in their hands. Have no idea why it is. And that's why Ohio said, hey, we don't want these kind of maps. And here to share some thoughts on what's going on in the state of Ohio, I've asked Katy Shanahan to come talk with us. Katy is the Ohio State Director of All on the Line, their website, allontheline.org. Katy, thanks for taking time for us.
Thank you, Rick.
So let's get right into it. Ohio is doing some very creative stuff again, even though you guys passed a ballot initiative a couple of years back so we wouldn't be in this place. Or am I missing something?
You're not missing anything. Ohioans actually went to the ballot twice in just the last 6 years in a flat rejection of everything that happened during the 2011 redistricting process, where our maps were drawn behind closed doors in a bunker. There was no real public input. And of course, it landed us with a decade of some of the most gerrymandered maps at both the state legislative and congressional level in the country. And so we went to the ballot in 2015 and in 2018, and we said, enough. We want fair maps drawn through a fair and transparent process where there is ample public input and conversation about what our communities need in new fair maps. And unfortunately, the Republicans in the state just sort of shrugged and said, we don't care. We're going to draw our maps again behind closed doors. We are going to curb public engagement as much as possible. We're not going to listen to any of the testimony that you all give about how best to represent your communities. And we ultimately are going to pass maps that are actually even more gerrymandered than the ones that we have now. So we unfortunately are even in a worse place than we were in 2011, despite two reforms demanding better.
Yeah, well, because they understand that the voters aren't going to hold them accountable. They know that their voters are never going to vote for the evil other side, because our political system has done a great job of saying the other side's evil. So they're never going to vote the other side, even if they're mad about what their guy did on the gerrymandering. And the other part of this, and this is what I get from Republicans who say, well, they're in control. That's the part of being in control. As long as it's their team that's in control, they're okay with it.
I always push back on that, because the reality is that gerrymandering, no matter who holds the pen, is wrong. Of course, in our system, in a representative democracy, we as voters should have full control over choosing who our politicians are. And even if we would like to hold our elected officials accountable, we can't, because we are essentially shut out of the political process because of our gerrymandered district. So even those voters who are fed up, myself included, I would love to vote out so many of my representatives, but I'm locked into who represents me because of what my district lines look like. And unfortunately, the Republicans have given us another few years under gerrymandered districts just like that.
Now, what's interesting is, a number of years back, a statewide election, Democrats actually had more votes than the Republicans did here in Pennsylvania. And somehow, with the gerrymandered maps they had back then, Republicans controlled 13 of the 18 congressional seats. And you go, how is it that there are 500,000 more Democrats in the state of Pennsylvania? And somehow Republicans were able to figure out how to get 13 of 18 seats in Congress. And you go, well, it's a creative pen.
Well, it's cheating is what it is. We just cut to the chase to say that gerrymandering is a form of cheating that allows you to rig district lines to undercut our ability to fully exercise our right to vote and to actually have a say in who represents us. And of course, the fallout impacts of that are vast, right? We can't make progress on any number of policies that impact every facet of our lives, not because there isn't public support for those issues, but because we simply are dealing with legislative bodies that just don't actually reflect how Ohioans feel. And the same can be true, obviously, of so many states across the country where, like you're saying, in even instances where one party gains more votes than the other, like with Democrats gaining more votes than Republicans in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in North Carolina, Republicans, because they control the pen during the redistricting process, rig elections so that they win even more seats than they're winning in votes, which of course is what we're fighting against.
It's crazy. You're listening to the Rick Smith Show here with Katy Shanahan. Katy is the Ohio State Director of All on the Line, their website, allontheline.org, if you want to take a look at that. If you got a question, comment, something you want to throw in on gerrymandering, maybe in your state, give us a call, 1-866-416-RICK, 1-866-416-7425. Now, one of the arguments that I get is, well, in Ohio, the voters in Ohio vote overwhelmingly for Republicans on the statewide level, so it doesn't really matter the gerrymandering. You're not Pennsylvania, where Pennsylvania's state row officers generally go to Democrats, even if Republicans had the gerrymandered districts, which, since the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania undid the gerrymandered maps, Democrats then did get the majority because, again, there are more. That's what the power of the vote is. But what do you say to that argument that, well, hey, statewide in Ohio, they're voting for Republicans. They're voting for Republicans in the districts. It's just that you Democrats, you're just not anywhere near the majority.
I've got two answers to that. The first is that Ohio is not actually an overwhelmingly red state. Across the last decade, Republicans have won just 54% of our vote. That's not an overwhelming amount. And yet, despite that fact, they have now gerrymandered themselves into 70% of our state legislative seats, and at the very least, 80% of our congressional seats. So if we were dealing with a proportional seat share where they're actually just getting as many seats as they get in votes, yes, they would still have the majority. None of us have ever argued that Democrats should get unearned majorities, but we should get an actual fighting chance that, reflects how we vote. The other answer to that, though, is that there are, of course, downstream impacts to gerrymandering that, yes, also spill over into statewide elections. When you're dealing with a party that has had a complete lock on power in our state government for the last decade because of gerrymandering, that inherently impacts what type of funding is coming in to political parties, to candidates. It impacts how people feel generally about the political process. There are so many people, not just voters, but also potential candidates, who look at the realities in Ohio and say, why would I ever run for office if I know that ultimately, the elections are predetermined because of these gerrymandered lines? So that, of course, has spillover impact to voter turnout levels. It has impact into whether political parties can actually build a bench of candidates to run for office. So while, yes, Republicans have won statewide elections recently, I would not say that we are an overwhelmingly red state. I'd say that we are an overwhelmingly rigged state, and that if you actually balance the scales, that you would see that start to shift.
And the other part of this is, you talked about people running for office. I'm more worried about people voting.
Yes,
I talk to people who are in districts that, their candidate is never going to win. And it's like, well, why do I bother going to the polls and voting when there's never a chance? Which is why I've said I'm not entirely against the idea of gerrymandering. And hear me out before you go jumping off the cliff and go, no, hair on fire. I'm not entirely against the idea if the goal of what's being gerrymandered is competitive districts. If we're looking for 50-50 balance where that's possible, and making competitive districts where people are running on ideas, not on pure arithmetic. For me, it's got to come back to the policies. It's got to come back to what people are doing to make lives better, and us believing that our government can do things. So now you can skewer me with, no, we could never do that.
Well, I will just gently push back. Of course, I would never endorse gerrymandering, but what I would suggest is you actually sort of gave away your answer in your remarks by saying that you think it's important to build competitive districts where they exist. We agree. Districts should inherently reflect the voters they're meant to represent. And so if you live in an area of the state that is a swing part of the state where inherently there is about an even divide between Democrats and Republicans, or there are a lot of independent voters that switch one party or the other, of course your district should reflect that fact. Here in Ohio, for example, of course there are parts of the state that are deep red Republican. There are other parts of the state that are deep red blue. Suggesting that those areas should instead be competitive is of course not representative of those areas. There are, however, other areas where there are growing populations, diversifying populations that are starting to trend one way or the other, right? So in suburbs around Columbus, for example, those suburbs, which when I was growing up were all very reliably Republican, are starting to trend Democratic, but they're still relatively competitive seats. The same can be said in the opposite side to areas of the state, for example, like the Mahoning Valley up by Youngstown, that were once bedrock Democratic parts of the state that are starting to trend the other way. The districts should reflect that fact. In fact, the districts should be able to shift one way or the other in a manner that actually reflects how people vote to, like you said, get to that end result where it's actually about policies and where voters' voices ultimately carry the day.
I don't disagree with you on that at all, and I'm not advocating for drawing another snake on the lake,
Yes,
because
no, no more
that's
snakes.
just ridiculous. It shouldn't take you a
Yeah,
day's drive to service your constituents if you're that
right.
representative. But I guess I'm looking for that era, that moment where you know where things are more competitive and we get back to the purity of politics rather than this gamesmanship. Now, as I understand, there was a legal challenge today. There were some oral arguments on
Yes,
how bad these maps you have in Ohio are. Can you
sure.
walk me through some of what was going on?
Sure, absolutely. So there are three different legal challenges to our new state legislative districts. One that was brought by the Ohio ACLU and the League of Women Voters and the A. Philip Randolph Institute and some other individual plaintiffs. One that was brought by the National Redistricting Action Fund, of which All in the Line is a part on behalf of 10 Ohio voters. And then the other suit was brought by the Brennan Center and the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, CARE Ohio, which is the Council on American Islamic Relations, and the Ohio Environmental Council. And each of those three cases argue essentially the same thing, which is that our maps are unduly favorable to Republicans over Democrats unconstitutionally. So, as part of our 2015 reform that changed how we go through the state legislative redistricting process, there is a very clear provision in the Ohio Constitution that not only bans maps that are partisan gerrymandered, that is, that unduly favor one party over the other, but that also require our maps to actually have what's called representational fairness. And what that means is that if you are a party that's only winning about 55% of the vote across the last decade, you should only be occupying about 55% of the seats. That is, that you have a direct proportional share of the seats based on the vote totals that you're getting in recent elections. Obviously, our maps do not actually match up with that proportion. Like I said, Ohio is a state that's voted just 54% Republican across the last decade, and yet nearly 70% of our state legislative seats are going to Republicans. So the bulk of the argument is that these maps are partisan gerrymandered. The other piece, though, is that, of course, they unnecessarily crack apart our communities. They dilute communities of color and their ability, especially, to see real pathways to political power. So the oral arguments before the Supreme Court were today, this morning. For the Republicans, of course, their argument is that rule about anti-partisan gerrymandering is merely aspirational. We weren't required to have gotten there. And I think I'm not going to delve too into reading the tea leaves, but it seemed like many of the justices were skeptical of that sort of assertion, that there are just provisions in the Constitution that you only have to sort of try to meet, that you don't actually have to meet them, that shall isn't a required term that you've got to live up to. So we now sort of play the waiting game to see not only, of course, whether or not the Supreme Court will actually overturn our maps. Of course, we're hoping that they do. But also, we're in a bit of a time crunch. Of course, we've got an upcoming election in 2022 and filing deadlines for candidates in just a couple of months. So I think the other huge remaining question is how quickly the court will go through this process. And then, so the way that the redistricting process works here in Ohio, if a court overturns the maps actually just go right back to the same authority that drew them in the first place. So they would go right back to the same 7-member politician commission that drew the maps originally back in September. And hopefully this time with very clear instructions from the Supreme Court about how to actually follow our Constitution and to draw fair maps. So that's what happened today at the court. And now, of course, we just play the waiting game.
Right. And this is why Republicans waited till the very last minute to release these maps, and why they delayed as long as they did. In fact, as I understand, as was explained to me, they violated some of the requirements to get to the point where they released it. Again, they know what they're doing. There's no, oh, gee, we didn't know. They knew exactly what they're doing. And I would guarantee, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, that they've already got the next map. If this is shot down, they've already got the next one, which is probably worse than this one.
Perhaps they do. You know, you're right to name that. Not only did our reform measure include rules about who draws the maps and how they have to be drawn, but it also included a timeline of due dates when the final maps were actually required to have been adopted. The commission blew past the first deadline. And actually the second deadline, we got our maps voted on just after midnight, the morning after that final deadline. And the ultimate final maps that got adopted were actually introduced by the Republican Senate president at 10:45 at night, just a little under 2 hours before the final deadline, and not a single member of the public got to testify on our final state legislative maps, which of course is not at all what Ohioans demanded through our reform measures. It's certainly not what our Constitution requires. So, you know, tip the tail, the entire process and the maps, of course, are an insult to our reforms. They're an insult to our Constitution, but you were absolutely right to name that, of course, the Republicans knew exactly what they were doing. They did the same playbook in our congressional process where they kept those maps in the can as long as possible. They curbed real public engagement. They ignored what we had to say anyways, and then they just rushed through partisan gerrymandered maps.
Of course they did, because that's what happens when you have unchecked power and you have an electorate who is not going to hold you accountable, and they know this, which is why it's important for groups like yours to be out there fighting, educating, informing. Katy, I appreciate you taking some time for us. Great talking with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You as well. Katy Shanahan, she is the Ohio State Director of On the Line, All on the Line, allontheline.org, the website. Check out the website. Get involved. Call your representative if you're in Ohio. Scream, holler, carry on. All of that. We should be choosing our politicians, not them, us. Quick break. Right back. Stick around.
And the union gives a voice to win. On the Rick Smith Show.